Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Big interview today, folks. I'm not going to lie, fanboyed out. Dan Jones, one of my favorite authors, his new book, Henry V. You've seen him. You've read his books. He's on Netflix. Seriously, you can go Google him right now. You've seen him before. This is just one of those bucket list interviews. I couldn't imagine that this was actually going to happen. Got on with him. Dan's immediately just super nice guy, super engaging. He made me feel comfortable, even though I was fanboying out. And we had a great conversation about Henry V. So instead of me babbling on about it, how about I shut up? Let's talk to Dan. And here we are with author Dan Jones, Henry V, the astonishing triumph of England's greatest warrior king. Dan, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, man.
Dan, I've really wanted to ask this question of you for a while. I'm going to jump right to it. Can we please get another season of Secrets of Great British Castles? Pretty please.
You know what? I would love to do another season. It's quite a while since we made those shows now. I'm thinking it was like, it's nearly 10 years, I think. So I can still remember going into the meeting with the commissioning editor, and it was the original commissioner. I know it shows on Netflix worldwide now, but the original commissioner was a network station in the UK called Channel 5. And I was literally in the meeting where I was getting hired to make a series of shows about the Plantagenets, which were loose adaptations of my books. And at the meeting where we were signing off this 4-part series about the Plantagenets, the commissioning editor, Simon Rakes, goes, "Hey, do you like castles?" And I'm like, "As much as the next guy." And he goes, "Listen, I've got to commission this show about castles one way or another. It's got funded like this. We just have to do it for X, Y reason. If you want it, you can do it. It's 6 episodes. And I was like, "Sure, man." So I walked out thinking I was going to get 4-episode deal. And I walked out with a 10-episode deal, which got renewed to both seasons got renewed. So we ended up in those 2 years making 20 shows, which was incredible. I was still in my 20s at that time. And we just had a blast. Okay, so Secrets of Great British Castles is very dear to my heart. I was really involved with writing the show. We had a fantastic team based out of Dublin, Ireland. We got to 2 seasons, and for one reason or another, some glitch happened with funding a third one. I can't even remember it. These things were quite complicated to fund. So it didn't happen that year. And then it just didn't happen again. And I know this is a question I get asked so much. When are you making a 3rd season? I'd love to make a 3rd season. But unfortunately, that era of TV commissioning, the budgets for those shows, which weren't excessive, but ran to £250,000 probably per episode, all told, those days are gone in British network television commissioning. And unfortunately for Netflix, unfortunately for me, I should say, with Netflix are commissioning at a much higher level, like in the millions of pounds budgets, and you're going to have Robert Downey Jr. doing the voiceover. So it kind of falls between 2 stools. I mean, I would love to find a way to revive that show in some form. I haven't given up hope, but it's not imminent.
All right, I'm going to do a deep Google. I'm going to find out who I need to email angrily. We're going to get on this.
It'll all come back to me. That's the trouble. Your angry email will just end up in my inbox, and I will have this conversation again.
Now, you do a lot of TV presenting. Obviously, we're here to talk about books, but I talked to Bettany Hughes. Mainly, I want to name drop her so I sound fancy. Another very famous history presenter. What's the perfect day for work for you? Is it you're in a library digging into some 500-year-old book, or getting in front of the TV and start bringing history to people?
That's a tricky one for me because, and I'm not trying to evade the question, and I'm sure Bettany, being an incredibly professional and brilliant and witty and charming woman, would have given you a better answer than this. But what I've always enjoyed over the last, let's say, 20 years of my career is variety. So, I was in the National Archives in London the other day, and we were digging through original documents from the 1350s for Edward III's Great Wardrobe, because it pertained to a novel that I'm writing at the moment. I'm out on book tour at the moment, talking to people, meeting readers, promoting my book about Henry V, and I love that part of the job. Television is an incredibly interesting storytelling challenge, and it is technically difficult to put TV stories together effectively. I also love working with big teams of people. Making television is exhausting, but it's tremendously rewarding. But I spend most of my time, I would say 80% of my time, in my study at home writing. That's the thing I'm best at, probably, and have been most comfortable doing over the years. I love the structural, technical challenges of writing. I like the, sentence level. I love to write book reviews and books and TV scripts and work with other authors, a second pair of eyes on their work. I love the whole business of writing. And for me, that's probably what it all comes down to. So a boring day at home with nothing in my diary and my laptop open in front of me, That's probably where I'm like happiest, but I do also need to get out of that from time to time. And so I've been very, very privileged and blessed to have a career that's allowed me to do this variety of different things and not get bored.
And now jumping to Henry V, you actually just did 2 fiction books. Did coming back to nonfiction kind of feel like coming home? Was it even more comfortable, or did you kind of show up thinking, I've learned all this new stuff and now I'm ready to dig into Henry V?
Great question. And I'm laughing because when I was out promoting Essex Dogs and Wolves of Winter, these first 2 novels in the trilogy, many readers asked me, do you think the experience of writing fiction, developing your craft as a novelist, is going to have an effect on your nonfiction? And I fended that question off and said, well, why don't you come and ask me when I've written another nonfiction book? And now, of course, that's come home to roost, and I still don't know. I mean, Henry V, I really, really enjoyed writing it. I couldn't say there's a book I've hated writing, but this one just felt like I was having a blast. The words were coming out real easy. I'd never written a biography before, so I was having fun working out what the specific demands of the biographical non-fiction form were, as opposed to, let's say, the sort of dynastic survey like the Plantagenets or Hollow Crown, Wars of the Roses, or the big survey like Powers and Thrones. So technically I was very interested in the writing. I mean, Henry V is a great story, full stop. You don't have to kind of mess around with a story too much as a writer. You just got to find effective ways to tell it. The experience of writing fiction, if pushed, I would say it probably added to my confidence as a writer, that I kind of felt like I knew what I was doing. And I felt empowered within myself to take, certain risks with the narrative style. The book is written in the present tense rather than the past historic tense, which would be the way we normally do podcasts and TV scripts as opposed to books. That was kind of a stylistic risk and challenge, but I think it's worked for reasons we can discuss if you want to. So I think it's confidence that novel writing gave me, if anything.
The present tense, and for people who don't read a lot of history books and maybe they're just listening to this, it's a huge risk in history. History books are generally not written like that. But as you say in your own introduction, you want this to feel more alive, to feel more present. Was it uncomfortable at first? Did you really have to think about it and then it just became natural throughout? Or was it something that you were fighting older instincts throughout?
Not really. I mean, the historic present, so let me give you, for listeners who are having trouble visualizing that abstract, a typical sentence in historic present would be, Henry sails from England to Normandy with the intent of taking the coastal town of Harfleur. Okay, that's 1415. And that would be the way we almost always narrate television. It's the way I narrate my podcast, This is History. It's the way that probably in most interviews like this, when I'm recounting historical stories, that's the mode we'll slip into. As I was sort of working out the ground rules, the bases for this biography of Henry V, bearing in mind that, as I've said, I'd never written a biography before, I was just kind of sketching, and not even on paper, just in my head, the first chapter where Henry's a young boy. He's growing up in his mother's household. I'm going through these records for, the clothes he's bought in summer and winter, the candle wax, the heartstrings, the little bits of everyday life. And in my head, I was telling myself this story. He's born in Monmouth Castle. He grows up under his mother's tutelage. He learns to love music and literature. I'm like, that's the way I'm talking. There was something that seemed right about trying to develop that style for a biography, because a medieval biography is you could see it as a contradiction in terms when compared to the modern biographical form, which is a modern biography is typically a psychological journey through a subject's life based almost always on thousands of documents that reveal the thoughts of your subject. You don't really have comparable weight and manner of documents for a medieval subject. So I was like, how is this biography going to draw us near, feel like we're really near Henry psychologically, and maintain sort of jeopardy within the storytelling when we know the outcome of, let's say, the Battle of Agincourt, or we know that he dies in 1422 of dysentery? How do you maintain that narrative tension? And this particular style for this book really just seemed to work. Now, played against that was I was very concerned that this would make readers recoil in horror, because it does sound experimental and weird, and it sounds like the imposition of me, the author, on the story, so you'll never be able to get away from me and my stylistic kind of acrobatics. But in fact, I found as I started to work, this was a great way of doing my favorite thing in writing, which is to make me, the author, disappear. I think good history, good nonfiction writing, arguably, particularly in the American tradition, is about you, the author, disappearing, vanishing, so that only the story and the reader exist, and you are just the kind of neutral, clear voice guiding this story to the reader. And anything that you do as the writer to interrupt that, to make yourself visible, to say, haha, look at my clever adverbs, look how wonderfully I alliterate, is annoying and jars the story. So my fear was that writing in the historic present would do exactly the thing I hate. But what I found the outcome was, the more I worked on this style, the less I was visible on the page, and the more you're just there with Henry V throughout his life, through the great trials and tribulations and the long journey he goes on. And that, for me, is the ultimate aim of writing narrative history. So I'm not going to do it forever, or I might never do it again, but it certainly served the purpose of this particular book.
Henry almost seems like the perfect person to do this with as well, because his life feels constantly active on the page. Because even when he's not doing something, and we can jump into this, your kind of point of this is there's that long-held idea that he was Hal when he was a kid, and then he became Henry. He went from this child running around doing whatever he wanted, perhaps a bit of a playboy, and then becomes this king that we know. But your book is more about that. This is just a slow building of a man that once he puts on the crown, he just uses all the tools that he's taken in. Is that an accurate interpretation of what you were going for with the book?
Yeah, Brendan, I think that's a very good interpretation. That's almost the perfect interpretation of what I was going for with this book. The classic model of Henry V's life, drawn from drama, is that Shakespeare gives us, which is across three plays, Henry IV, Part 1, Part 2, and Henry V. You have the playboy, Prince Hal, womanizing, drunken, layabout, roistering, keeper of bad company, like most of my friends, actually.
Mine too.
Okay, we're going to get along. And so this is the Prince Hal, who up until the age of 26 looks like a basket case. At 26, just in time when his father dies, he gets his act together, sends away his low company friends. And from that point on, he's all business. So that when we get to the dramatic payoff in Shakespeare, the Battle of Agincourt, Henry shows everything that he's learned to that point, both the seriousness and the weight of the crown of kingship, and that little bit of the common touch which he's retained from his Prince Hal days for use in extremis. That's a great dramatic story. And Shakespeare is, Shakespeare's Shakespeare. What more do we need to say? This is what he does. It's not historically very accurate. I mean, the reality of Henry V's life was that he's born in 1386. For the first 12 years of his life, he's being raised as a sort of scion of the House of Lancaster, the greatest noble house in England. At the age of 12, his father usurps the throne, becomes Henry IV. From that point on, Henry is a heartbeat away from becoming king, and then he has a very hard, hands-on apprenticeship in the arts of warrior kingship, fighting in Wales, managing his father's council, getting involved in the French wars, which are escalating because of the great divisions under the madness of King Charles VI. So when he comes to the throne, the crown in 1413, age 26, he's not like some layabout who hasn't bothered. It's Batman Begins. The guy's had like the ultimate training, and he hits the ground running, so that even though this king, who reigns for the shortest time of any Plantagenet crowned king, so putting aside Edward V, other than Richard III, this guy achieves more than anybody else in his 9 years as king. And that's the story. You can only understand that by borrowing Shakespeare's structure, which is to say, give sufficient time in your narrative to Henry's youth, and by discarding Shakespeare by saying, but don't kid yourself that this is a sort of a neat coming-of-age drama. It's something very different.
And you mentioned his father, Henry IV. There's just a lot of things that seem to line up for Henry V's life so that he can do all of those things and be ready for the throne. Henry IV seems to be kind of the perfect tutor in sometimes what to do and what not to do, because he's dealing with so much stress, as you say, usurping the throne, which means there's going to be a lot of people coming back, pretenders left and right. It almost seems like Henry V is also, for lack of a better term, lucky with how he is brought up because he's going to learn those lessons firsthand. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, I'm not going to go on and on and on about Shakespeare, or maybe I am, but what does the chorus say when he comes onto the stage in the epilogue of Henry V? He says of Henry, fortune made his sword. So he was not fated to become king, and yet he did. And he was lucky. He was lucky again and again and again. But he made the most of that luck. I think in terms of role models, and look, Henry V grows up under two kings, Richard II, Henry IV. And Richard II is the sort of, in many ways, with one notable exception, the opposite of what you want from a medieval king. He's narcissistic, he's paranoid, he's self-centered, he's solipsistic, he's vicious, he's vain, he's completely false and damaging understanding of what the demands of kingship are. And he pitches himself constantly against his own people. He's good at one thing, and that is the showmanship of kingship. He's good at projecting majesty. And I think that Henry V, who as a young boy is in and around that royal court and sees Richard up close and personal. Richard knights him on campaign in Ireland. Richard's fond of saying that he heard a prophecy that this kid is going to be king himself one day. Richard is an interesting influence on Henry V. His father, to turn to the subject of your question, Henry IV, is also an interesting influence. I mean, he's much more of a sort of, when I was studying history at Cambridge, it's called a director of studies. You know, he takes Henry and he says that, you know, you are going to have to learn this job in a hands-on apprenticeship. So, and he does it with his eldest three sons, Henry, Thomas, the future Duke of Clarence, and John, the future Duke of Bedford. He sends them all off when they're teenagers to the toughest parts of the English kingdom to get an education in what it really takes to be a king. So John goes to the north, Scottish borders, Thomas goes to Ireland, and Henry goes to Wales, where he has to defend his title of Prince of Wales against the rebellious would-be, ruler of Wales, Owain Glyndŵr. Henry IV gives his son a really tough lesson in kingship, but he also, much like Richard, teaches him a little bit of what not to do, as you've pointed out. Henry IV labours under the burden of usurpation for his whole reign. Partly that's a practical burden. It means that he's constantly in hock to the people who've made him king. The House of Percy, the Earls of Northumberland, the endless Lancastrian retainers and annuitants who are expected to be paid a pension every year to reward them for their good service and their loyalty. He's constantly fending off threats from a variety of sources, whether it's Owain Glyndŵr in Wales, whether it's the ghost of Richard II, who's murdered in 1400 whilst in prison, but who's, endless people say, Richard's still alive, we're going to get him back. Whether it's the Percys rebelling, whether it's even his own Archbishop of York, Archbishop Scrope, who he has beheaded for his part in a rebellion, a shocking murder, probably the most shocking murder of an ecclesiastic since Thomas Becket's murder in 1170 by Henry II. And then he labours under this moral burden that he senses that he's done something fundamentally very bad, which is to even if the political reasons for usurping the throne were clear and unarguable at the time, he's kind of torn the fabric of the universe in a way that he can't put back together. So Henry V, seeing all this, has, from Richard and Henry IV, has great counterexamples in his how not to do it. But he also, thanks to his father, Henry IV, has a real practical hands-on training. And these are the nuts and bolts of kingship. And he spends 13 years learning them.
You just mentioned something. It made me think about, this was something else that jumped out of the book to me. Henry's got brothers.
Yeah.
And while each of them have their own foibles, they're pretty much well-suited for the times. They're competent in a lot of different ways. It's funny reading a book. I know that neither of them try and take the crown, but you're just so used to in British history that if there is other competent people, especially within the royal family, you just kind of assume sooner or later they're going to reach for the crown. But they actually had, with a couple of bumpy times here and there, a very good relationship between the brothers, right?
Let's take the whole Plantagenet era and think of some comparable moments. Go right back to the start. Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine. You've got Henry the Young King, Richard, Geoffrey, John. Those guys are constantly at war with each other, with their own father. Constant rebellion. Even when there's two men left standing, Richard the Lionheart as king, and John. John is trying to depose his own brother. He's trying to have him kept in prison when he's arrested on his way back from the Third Crusade. It's a nightmare. Fast forward to the 15th century, the House of York. You've got Edward IV, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III. That psychodrama is exactly the same. During Edward IV's reign, George Duke of Clarence rebelling and having to be drowned in a vat of Malmsey wine. As soon as Edward IV dies, Richard III ripping the throne away from Edward IV's kids. I mean, yes, so these are really interesting counterexamples. Even Edward III, who with his 5 sons had a pretty decent brood, they were still a mixed bag. But then you come and look at Henry IV's kids, Henry V, Thomas Duke of Clarence, John Duke of Bedford, Humphrey Duke of Gloucester. Clarence is probably the weak link in the sense that he's just all fight and he's kind of bullheaded and he's not possessed of enormously good judgment, but he's loyal by and large. John Duke of Bedford is the equal of Henry V in almost every way. Humphrey Duke of Gloucester is rather widely disliked during the when he's the only survivor from Henry V's times, but that's only because he gets this sort of dogged determination to protect and preserve his eldest brother's legacy at all costs, as he sees it, which runs him into political problems. But these are really, really competent, loyal siblings, and you can't really understand Henry V's reign without factoring in that there wasn't just one of him. There were 4 of them. They were like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like they came as a package and they worked together incredibly effectively. I mean, Henry in France rotating Humphrey Duke of Gloucester, John Duke of Bedford out. So one's regent in England, one's in France with him. It's a real testament to their own characters and I think to the way that Henry IV had carefully succession planned with them.
And now, Henry V, we've kind of talked about this, but if you can talk about this very specific incident, because I think it sets up perfectly where you talk about Henry V knows how important things need to look and sound and have to happen. So the incident with John Badby, man who decides he thinks something that everyone else doesn't think. Back in these days, that's a horrible thing to do when it comes to religion. Can you talk about this scene where John is about to have a really bad day, and how does Henry orchestrate that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an amazing story. During the time that Henry is Prince of Wales. So his father is on the throne, but his father is increasingly afflicted by illness, by disease. So Henry's really the sort of driving force in English politics and effectively the regent of the kingdom at this time. The religious situation in England during the beginning of the 15th century, so we're in year 1410 now. The religious situation in England at this time is you've got a small but growing movement known as Lollardy. This is a pejorative term the Lollard is a pejorative term given to followers of the teachings of the radical Oxford theologian John Wycliffe, who'd been under the patronage and protection of Henry's grandfather, John of Gaunt, a third son of Edward III. Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards, so-called, you can see them in a way as proto-Protestants. They believed in radical redistribution of church wealth, of personal engagement with scripture. They were very suspicious of what, people like Luther in the 16th century have become very suspicious of, which were practices of the Catholic Church, which didn't seem to be derived from scripture, but only from tradition. Lollardy had lots of roots in the sort of artisan urban classes of England. And in 1410, one such Lollard, a guy called John Badby, a tailor from Evesham, which is sort of in the English Midlands, was burned in a barrel. Now, that means he was burned at the stake, but a barrel was to be placed around him to concentrate the flames upon him. He was being burned as a heretic. Now, Badby had been in prison for ages and had been given multiple chances to recant, but he refused to do so. And in fact, every time he was brought out to recant, he would sort of double down on his heresies. The political backstory to him being burned, because burnings at this point were not commonplace for Lollards or indeed heretics in general. But there had been a movement in Parliament by a group of Lollards to force through a bill that would take away a lot of church land and use it to re-endow the crown and the country and the universities with massive amounts of wealth that would plug a hole in the budget, if you like. That had been sort of slapped down in Parliament, and John Badby is effectively the scapegoat. It's a public symbol that we're not going to put up with this sort of nonsense from the Lollards. Now, Henry, as regent and effectively in charge of his father's government in 1410, takes a leading role in this burning, which is happening, just outside London. And it's a pivotal point in his political development because he is of the younger generation and he's surrounded, he's partially surrounded by Lollards, people like John Oldcastle, a good friend of his, who are sort of openly supportive of the Lollard movement. He's at this point, like, does he side with this Lollard movement for a sort of radical reconstitution of how English politics and religion works, the youth movement, let's say, or does he stand back and say, I don't want any part of this? And he has this political instinct that he sort of manages to have it both ways. He turns up at Badby's burning, and as Badby's being sort of tied to the stake and the fires are being lit, he steps forward and orders the barrel to be removed, and he offers Badby this chance to recant. He stretches out his hand and he says, if you recant this heresy, all will be forgiven. I'll pay you a pension for the rest of your life, and we can have peace, we can have reconciliation. So he positions himself as a sort of moderate, as somebody who's prepared to deal peaceably with Lollards, and it's symbolic, it's public. It's performative. It's the sort of thing Richard II had been quite good at, this sort of public performance. But Badby refuses. And eventually he's put back on the fire and the barrel is placed over him and up he goes in smoke. And Henry from that point on is able to say, well, look, I gave Lollardy a chance. I gave Lollards a chance to sort of come in and from the cold and to sort of tone down their pitch. They wouldn't take it. So what do you expect me to do? And he's got these sort of instincts more or less all the way through his career. He's very good at putting into single sort of tableau-like public performance quite sophisticated political positions. And he's also very clear and decisive. I mean, I don't think there is any point in his mind where he's going to say, I'm throwing in with the Lollards. He's quite conservative and traditional in his own personal piety. But he's not so stiff-necked or bullheaded that he's just going to say, burn him, and while you're at it, bring in all the other Lollards you can find and burn them. He's got this sort of political flexibility to him.
And it's kind of the perfect counter-argument for how some people try and make him look, which is he's a warmonger, right? We remember him because of Agincourt. That's why he didn't do much else. But it's situations like this show that he has true political acumen along with the fact that he knew how to fight.
Yeah, I mean, he is a warmonger. He's a warmonger who's also a great politician. And like his great-grandfather, Edward III, under whose reign the 100 Years' War had begun in 1337, Henry understands that you can't fight unless you pay for it. What does that mean? Well, it means doing the job of a king in the round. It's no good just coming to the throne and saying, we're just going to fight. Fighting's the only thing that matters. There's no possible way to do it unless you realize that kingship is about, on the one hand, if you think about the Great Seal of England, it has two sides to it. And on the one hand, you have the king as lawgiver, seated as a judge, effectively. And on the other hand, you have the king as warrior with a sword in his hand on horseback. They're two sides of the same job. So when Henry becomes king, what you see is the first things on his to-do list as king are all to do with domestic politics, are all to do with law and order. It leads this sweeping campaign to crack down on rioters, on gangs, on breakers of the law. He holds parliaments to which he invites a sort of open season for questions and for demands for reform in his kingdom. He listens. He's a consultative, collaborative king who doesn't, unlike Richard II, become sort of enraged and offended if anyone has the temerity to challenge his leadership or the business of the crown. He listens, he offers remedy, and then he asks for what he wants, which typically is taxation, because he's fixed on this idea that it is a matter of critical importance that justice is done with regards to France. And justice means there's a whole bunch of lands which rightfully belong to the Plantagenet crown, principally Normandy, but not only Normandy. And by the way, the French crown itself actually belongs to us. So that's pursuing that and pursuing justice and seeing that justice, as he would see it, is done on the foreign realm, demands that he listens to his people and offers justice in the domestic realm. That was the Edward III playbook. And Edward III, when he got it right, had this incredible string of successes in the middle of the 14th century. Battle of Sluis, 1340, Battle of Crécy, 1346, Siege of Calais, 1347, Battle of Winchelsea, 1350, Battle of Poitiers, 1356. Each one of these a serious and very significant victory, which made Edward III the great warrior prince in Europe. And if he died in 1361, we would talk, just after the Treaty of Bretigny, we would talk about Edward III in the same hallowed tones that we talk about Henry V. But Edward III lived longer, and we saw more decay and backsliding in his reign.
kind of bring it full circle, we've talked about how this book, we've just gone over some examples. There's a heck of a lot more in the book, obviously, but almost kind of correcting the popular view that Shakespeare puts out there. Do you ultimately think Shakespeare's presentation of Henry V helps or hurts his legacy? Because on the one hand, Shakespeare makes it much more popular to know even some of the main points of his life, but at the same time, it does kind of do this, as we talked about, Hal Henry dichotomy. Ultimately, do you think Shakespeare helped or hurts Henry's legacy?
He helps to build this idea, which is rooted in historical fact, that Henry was the greatest warrior prince of his dynasty. I mean, I don't think there's any argument about that. The scale of his conquests is unrivaled by anybody. The effectiveness, the efficiency with which he went about his business was astonishing. His willingness to roll the dice at Agincourt. He was one of those lucky generals, as Napoleon would have put it, that everyone wants. He did it all. And Shakespeare captures that in the play Henry V. He mangles it somewhat. I mean, that's literally the word he uses. Again, in the epilogue, the chorus says, "We've mangled by turns the full course of their glory," talking about the people who've just been on stage. And Shakespeare never tries to obfuscate or hide what he's doing. He's turning history to his own ends, just as generations of other historical dramatists and writers have also done from then till now. You're always looking, though, with Shakespeare, and it's not just Henry V, it's all 8 of those the two tetralogies, all 8 of the history plays, chronologically from Richard II to Richard III, which are so brilliant that it means you're always looking through the lens of Shakespeare when you think about the 15th century. And I wrestled with this when I did my Wars of the Roses book all those years ago. Without Shakespeare, it's a much harder sell, you know what I mean, in terms of getting people to think about and engage with the real history of Henry V's reign. So I would never complain about Shakespeare's distortions, because it wasn't Shakespeare's intent to write history books. He was writing drama. And because it means that there's name recognition for these characters, which is what we need if we want people to be interested in history books.
I mean, he should already just be famous, because who else gets shot in the face with an arrow as, I believe he was a teenager, and lives through it and then still has what happened to him? I mean,
I'll tell you who else gets shot in the face with an arrow at his comparable age is David II of Scotland, and they never get all the arrow out of his head, and he suffers with acute migraines all his life. Henry V shot in the face at Shrewsbury in 1403, thanks to the agency of John Bradmore, his father's great surgeon. They managed to extract the arrowhead from 6 inches deep in his skull. The most astonishing operation, which takes a month effectively to carry out. And this is, as I argue in the book, or I sort of heavily imply in the book, because you can't root it in a sort of definitive statement from Henry himself. But this is surely character forming in some very basic way. The first battle, he only fights 2 battles, but at the first one, age 16, he's miraculously saved from instant death when he's shot in the face with an arrow, and doesn't die during the operation. I don't think it's going too far to suggest that this is a moment at which a young boy might well think, God has saved me for a reason.
Now, I'm going to be able to somehow magically send you back in time.
Well, thank you.
And you're allowed to interview one person that's in this book. I'm not going to let it be Henry. That's too easy. You get an hour, and they're going to tell you the truth. They have to actually answer your questions fully. Who's it going to be?
That's a fascinating question. Henry was surrounded he had a core of very loyal friends around him. People like the Earls of Warwick and Arundel, his good friend Richard Courtenay, Chancellor of Oxford University and Bishop. But I think I'd mentioned Oldcastle once already. John Oldcastle, Henry's friend, ally, supporter in the Welsh Wars, early supporter, and proxy for in England, became more involved in the Burgundian-Armagnac conflict in France. And then Oldcastle is arrested for his Lollard beliefs. Henry abandons him. He tries to save him from himself, but Oldcastle refuses to recant his Lollard heresies, and then escapes from the Tower of London, where he's imprisoned awaiting burning to death, and is eventually run to ground by John, Duke of Bedford. I think that would be an interesting character to talk to, because he knew Henry very well. He didn't get him right, but he knew him well. And I think that this sort of critical friend, rather than the absolute sort of right-hand man, staunch consigliere ally, is sometimes the more interesting type of person to talk to, because I think you'd have a nuanced, intelligent and critical view of this great king that would add immensely to our understanding of him.
I know historians hate when I ask that question, but I can see whenever I ask somebody, there's like 20 names in your head, and you're like, which one am I going to pick?
The other option is Catherine de Valois, his wife, because, she can come across as this kind of pawn in the great chess game of France and England in the 100 Years' War. And she is in part, although Henry is at pains not to allow her to be politically framed as such, but she is in part his vessel to the French crown. It's her marriage that follows the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, by which he takes effectively takes the French crown away from Charles VI. She is the mother of Henry VI, and she goes on to have this romantic liaison with Owen Tudor, from which the whole Tudor line springs. So she's another fascinating character who would have a good view not only on Henry as kind of enemy and as a scourge of her father, her family, her realm. She would then have a view on being queen. She would have a view on being the mother of the hapless Charles VI. And she had a view of being the ultimate matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. So she's another incredibly... And not that she would know this, but after her death, her mummified corpse was sitting in the corner of Westminster Abbey for a good few hundred years. And Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist of the 17th century, came along on the occasion of his 36th birthday in the morning and snuck a kiss of her embalmed corpse. And he writes about it in his diary. So, she wouldn't be able to give us her view on that, but she does have an interesting afterlife as well as a life.
Do you get the chance yourself to read history when you're not researching? And if so, is there anybody for the audience that you would want to recommend that, hey, I love Dan Jones, what else should I read? You already mentioned Michael Livingston's Agincourt. It's one of my favorites. Anybody else? Or do you even get time to read for yourself?
I read a lot. I try and read pretty widely as well. I read like fiction, non-fiction. I review books for the Sunday Times in the UK, so I get sent a fair number of history books to review. This year, for medieval nerds, I would highly recommend, this book comes out this week in the UK and mid-October in the US, Helen Castor's book, The Eagle and the Heart, which is a double biography of Richard II and Henry IV. Absolutely fantastic. Helen's a truly brilliant medievalist. In fact, 25 years ago, she was my first supervisor at university. So she, in a sense, taught me everything I know. So that's a wonderful book. Earlier this year, Justine Fernhaber Baker's House of Lilies, which was a sort of a dynastic history of the Capetian dynasty, was really good. I'd written the Plantagenets all those years ago. That's a sort of equivalent for the Capetian dynasty. And yesterday, when I was flying, I'm in New York now, but while I was flying over from London, on the plane, there was blessedly no Wi-Fi. So I got to read a whole book on the plane, which was called The Scapegoat by Lucy Hughes Hallett, which is a biography. We're skipping a little bit later to the early Stuart period. It's a biography of George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham, the great royal favourite of James I and Charles I, and lover of James I, and accumulator of enormous wealth, titles, and popular disaffection. Amazing book. So I've just reviewed that for a newspaper for the Sunday Times. But those are off the top of my head. Those are 3 recent history books I've really enjoyed.
All right, last question for you, Dan. The reason why we have History Nerds United is because we honestly think there's a lot of people out there who love history. They don't know it yet because they had history in high school. They were bored to hell. They passed it and they want to be done with it. If I got one of those poor misguided souls and sat them in front of you and they said, Dan, why should I read Henry V? What would you say?
Henry V, even if you're not interested in Plantagenet history, this is a great case study in leadership in a time of crisis. In a world torn apart by political partisanship, plots against the government, the lingering after effects of a pandemic, a seemingly intractable rolling crisis in politics, which just doesn't seem structurally possible to fix. Along comes one leader and, as it were, the blink of an eye fixes everything. And that is the great fantasy or the great keening, yearning desire, I think, of many people in our times today. I'm not saying the issues in 2024 are the same as the issues in 1413, but the feeling that if only there was a sort of savior out there who could save us from this crumbling political edifice we see all around us, you'll recognize that. And this book is, as I say, it's a great case study in that. It's also a terrific story.
Totally agree, Dan. The book is fantastic. This was a thrill. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
My pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Dan, thank you so much. Henry V, go out and get it, everybody. It is a book that literally anyone will enjoy. You don't have to be a history nerd. If you want to dip your toe in, this is one of those books to do it with. Hit us up Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.